Chapter 1, Video 5. Today we're going to talk about coronary arteries. One thing about the coronary arteries that you need to know is the coronary arteries are responsible for supplying the heart muscle with its blood, nutrients, and oxygen. So the same way that the heart pumps blood out to the rest of the body to provide oxygen and to pick up the CO2 and the waste and bring it back to the lungs, it does the same for the heart. So it has its own circulation. So basically what happens, the myocardium extracts nutrients and oxygen from these coronary arteries. And this deoxygenated blood is returned to the right atrium by the coronary sinus. So the coronary sinus is basically a large vein that looks like a coronary artery, but it's in more depth. So the myocardium, that's the muscle part of the heart. It receives its blood supply during diastoles at rest, and there again, this is where that exchange occurs. The blood is giving oxygen to that heart muscle, and it's picking up those waste. But one really important thing that you need to remember is diastole. That is the resting phase that we talked about. When the heart is not pumping, you have that second that it's not squeezing. During that time frame is when the heart is receiving its oxygen and giving back the waste. So when it's squeezing down, it's not that myocardium is not accepting the oxygen in the blood flow. So at the time that it is relaxed is whenever it receives its at the time that it's relaxed, that's when it receives the blood and the oxygen and it takes on the nutrients. The coronary arteries arise from the base of the aorta, and again, they kind of course along that epicardial surface, that outer layer of the heart, and they dive down into that myocardium to provide that blood supply. So when we talk about them diving down into that myocardium and that being where that exchange occurs, if we have a blockage in one of these arteries, that is what causes myocardial infarctions, because the blockages is impeding the blood flow and the heart muscle itself is not getting the oxygen and nutrients that it needs. We're going to talk about the different coronary arteries. We have the left main coronary artery, which is known as the LMCA. There's two branches. It provides blood flow to the walls of the left ventricle, anterior and lateral, and this artery perfuses about 60% of the myocardium, okay? So that's pretty big. Like I said, it provides the blood flow to the wall of the left ventricle, and we know that left ventricle is responsible for pushing blood out to the rest of the body. And then it perfuses about 60% of the myocardium, so that's over half of the heart that the LMCA, that the left main coronary artery, is supplying. So when blockages occur in the LMCA, the left main coronary artery, it can produce a huge myocardial infarction, because if this is blocked, over 60% of our heart's not getting oxygen. So when a blockage occurs in this artery, that's bad. That's very bad because of the amount that it provides to the heart. With that being said, if a heart attack occurs in the LMCA, it's often known as the Widowmaker. So I would remember that. It's known as the Widowmaker. Why? Because people do not live when they suffer a heart attack in the Widowmaker. Now, we're going to break this down further. The LMCA, the left main coronary artery, it has two main branches. So the LMCA further branches off, okay? It branches into the LAD, which is the left anterior descending artery. This branch supplies blood flow to the anterior wall of the left ventricle. And then it also branches off into what we call the circumflex. And this branch feeds the lateral wall of the left ventricle. So it's the left side wall of the left ventricle. So the LMCA, the left main coronary artery, comes down and then it further branches off into the LAD and the circumflex. So make sure that you know that. You will be seeing that. I'm sure you will have questions on that. Next, we're going to talk about the RCA. The RCA is the right coronary artery. This feeds the right ventricle and inferior bottom wall of the left ventricle, okay? So it feeds the right ventricle and the inferior wall of the left ventricle. This artery actually gives rise to the posterior descending PDA in 70% of the people. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But the RCA goes down and then it branches off into the, it gives rise to the PDA, the posterior descending artery, in 70% of the people. In 30% of the population, the PDA, the posterior descending artery, in 30% of the people, the PDA rises from the circumflex artery. So, back to the LMCA, when we were talking about the LAD and the circumflex, in 30% of the people, that circumflex further branches off and gives rise to the PDA. But in 70% of the people, it comes from the RCA. One thing, the PDA is known as the posterior descending artery, and it feeds the posterior wall of the heart. If it arises from the RCA, that means you are right side dominant. If it arises from the circumflex, that means you have a left dominant heart. So that's important to know. Now, where it arises from, if the PDA arises from the circumflex or whether it arises from the RCA, that is of no concern. It does not matter. It's not a problem. It doesn't cause a problem. As long as the heart's getting the blood that it needs, it's not an issue. And when we look at this slide, you can just get an idea of where these you can get an idea of where these arise. So you can kind of look at this picture and be familiar with the location of the different arteries. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please let me know.